Hurricane Wilma began as a relatively small weather disturbance in the Caribbean Sea in October 2005, but what started as a cluster of thunderstorms would quickly evolve into one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. The storm first formed as a tropical depression on October 15, 2005, southeast of Jamaica, where warm sea surface temperatures and favorable atmospheric conditions fueled its rapid development. Over the next few days, Wilma strengthened into a tropical storm, and by October 18th, it had reached hurricane status. The storm's intensification was nothing short of astonishing. Meteorologists closely monitored Wilma as it rapidly intensified into a Category 5 hurricane within just 24 hours, a phenomenon that stunned experts. By October 19th, Wilma's central pressure plummeted to 882 millibars, making it the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin at that time. With sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, the storm's eye wall became tightly organized, and its eye shrank to just 2 miles in diameter, creating a pinhole eye that is characteristic of the most intense hurricanes. As Wilma reached its peak intensity, it became clear that the storm was a force of nature unlike anything seen before. The hurricane's path remained unpredictable at first, as it meandered slowly over the Caribbean Sea. This created widespread uncertainty for residents across the region, who anxiously waited to see where the storm would strike next. While some hoped the storm would weaken before making landfall, Wilma's sheer strength made it one of the most threatening hurricanes of the 2005 season, a year that was already notorious for deadly storms like Katrina and Rita. After days of uncertainty, Hurricane Wilma began to move northwest, setting its sights on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula as the storm approached. Officials in the region issued urgent warnings for residents to evacuate, especially in the popular tourist destinations of Cancun, Cozumel, and Playa del Carmen. Despite these warnings, many locals and tourists found themselves trapped as the storm arrived sooner than expected. On October 21st, Wilma made its first devastating landfall as a Category 4 hurricane near Cozumel. The Yucatan Peninsula bore the brunt of Wilma's fury for over 48 hours as the storm stalled over the region, moving at an agonizingly slow pace. This prolonged the destruction as the hurricane's powerful winds and torrential rains battered the area. Winds of over 150 miles per hour uprooted trees, destroyed buildings, and left entire neighborhoods submerged in floodwaters. The storm surge along the coast swallowed beaches and inundated coastal properties, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would take months, if not years, to repair. In Cancun, the once bustling hotel zone was reduced to a wasteland of shattered glass, debris, and ruined infrastructure. The iconic beaches that attracted millions of tourists each year were eroded, and many hotels were forced to close indefinitely. Inland areas were also not spared, as Wilma's heavy rainfall led to widespread flooding, cutting off communities and causing rivers to overflow. Residents were left without power or clean drinking water for days, and rescue operations were hampered by the widespread destruction. The death toll in Mexico, though relatively low compared to other major hurricanes, was a testament to the storm's immense power and the swift response from local authorities who managed to evacuate many residents before the worst of the storm hit. After wreaking havoc on the Yucatan Peninsula, Hurricane Wilma finally began to move northward across the Gulf of Mexico, but the storm was far from over. As it moved over the warm waters of the Gulf, Wilma began to reorganize, regaining strength after weakening slightly during its prolonged stay over land. Meteorologists closely tracked the storm's progress, noting that it could potentially intensify again before making a second landfall in the United States. By October 23rd, Wilma had regained Category 3 status, with maximum sustained winds of around 115 miles per hour, making it a formidable threat to the U.S. Gulf Coast. Forecasters predicted that the storm would take aim at Florida, particularly the southern part of the state, where residents were already preparing for the worst. Mandatory evacuation orders were issued for low-lying coastal areas, and millions of people scrambled to secure their homes, stock up on supplies, or leave the state entirely. Florida was no stranger to hurricanes, but the sheer unpredictability of Wilma's path, combined with the fact that the 2005 hurricane season had already been so deadly, left many residents feeling anxious and uncertain about what was to come. As Wilma approached, Florida Governor Jeb Bush urged residents to take the storm seriously, emphasizing the potential for significant damage. By October 24th, Wilma made its second landfall near Cape Romano, Florida, as a Category 3 hurricane. The storm tore through the southern part of the state, bringing with it destructive winds, heavy rainfall, and a dangerous storm surge. Even though the hurricane's intensity had decreased slightly, it still caused widespread damage across Florida, especially in densely populated areas like Naples, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. Hurricane Wilma's impact on Florida was both swift and severe. As the storm made its way across the state, it brought down power lines, uprooted trees, and damaged thousands of homes and businesses. Winds of up to 120 miles per hour ripped off roofs, shattered windows, and left entire communities without power for weeks. In the Miami metropolitan area, high-rise buildings were particularly vulnerable, with many experiencing broken windows and structural damage. Streets were littered with debris, making travel nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath of the storm. One of the most significant challenges in the wake of Wilma was the widespread power outages. Over 6 million people were left without electricity, and many regions struggled to restore power for weeks after the storm had passed. In some areas, residents faced long lines at gas stations, grocery stores, and supply centers as they tried to gather the resources they needed to survive. The damage to infrastructure was immense, with roads washed out, bridges damaged, and water systems disrupted. Hospitals and emergency services were overwhelmed, particularly in South Florida, where the storm had hit the hardest. Despite the destruction, Florida's residents showed resilience in the face of disaster. Neighbors helped each other clear debris, and local authorities worked tirelessly to restore order and get essential services back up and running. However, the financial toll was staggering, with early estimates suggesting that Wilma caused billions of dollars in damage. For many Floridians, the storm's aftermath was a long and difficult recovery process, with some areas taking years to fully rebuild. In the days and weeks following Hurricane Wilma, the focus shifted to recovery and rebuilding. Federal, state, and local agencies, along with volunteers from across the country, worked to provide aid to the hardest hit areas. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, played a significant role in coordinating disaster relief efforts, providing temporary housing, food, and financial assistance to those affected by the storm. However, the scale of the damage meant that recovery was slow and uneven, with some communities, particularly in rural areas, struggling to access the help they needed. The agricultural sector in Florida was particularly hard hit by Wilma, with citrus groves and sugarcane fields experiencing extensive damage. This had a ripple effect on the state's economy, as the agricultural industry was a major contributor to Florida's overall financial health. Farmers faced months of uncertainty as they worked to salvage what they could from their crops and rebuild their livelihoods. Wilma also had a lasting impact on hurricane preparedness in the United States. The storm served as a stark reminder of the importance of early evacuation orders and the need for more robust infrastructure capable of withstanding such powerful storms. In the years following Wilma, Florida and other hurricane-prone states invested heavily in improving their emergency response systems, reinforcing buildings and educating the public about hurricane safety. As part of the historic 2005 hurricane season, which also included the infamous Hurricane Katrina, Wilma is remembered as one of the most intense and destructive storms to ever hit the Atlantic. Its legacy endures not only in the physical scars left on the regions it struck, but also in the collective memory of those who lived through it. For many, the experience of Hurricane Wilma was a sobering reminder of nature's destructive power and the importance of preparedness in the face of such deadly storms. In October 1998, Hurricane Mitch struck Central America, leaving a trail of destruction and heartache. This hurricane may not have been as famous as others in the United States, but its impact was devastating. The storm originated in the Caribbean Sea, gaining strength and momentum as it approached the coast of Honduras. While hurricanes are common in this region, Mitch was different. This hurricane became the second deadliest on record, claiming approximately 11,000 lives and causing widespread destruction across Honduras and Nicaragua. The disaster not only took lives, but also left countless people homeless, erasing decades of progress in these countries. Hurricane Mitch's journey began when a tropical wave moved off the coast of Africa on October 10th. It traveled across the Atlantic and eventually formed into Tropical Depression 13 on October 22nd over the southwestern Caribbean Sea. This storm initially seemed to be heading toward the Yucatan Peninsula, but shifted directions unexpectedly, making its way toward Honduras. The hurricane took its time, pausing for 2 days over Honduras and unleashing relentless rainfall that would have catastrophic effects. In the end, Mitch became more than just a storm. It was a natural disaster that tested the resilience of communities and governments in Central America. Hurricane Mitch formed due to a combination of factors that created favorable conditions for a tropical storm. After developing into Tropical Storm Mitch on October 23rd, it quickly intensified. As the storm moved slowly northward, it encountered warm waters and good outflow, which allowed it to strengthen into a hurricane on October 24th. By October 25th, Mitch became a major hurricane, and just a day later, it was classified as a Category 5 hurricane, with maximum sustained winds reaching 180 miles per hour. As the hurricane approached, governments across Central America sprang into action. The Honduran government evacuated about 100,000 people from vulnerable coastal areas, especially from the Bay Islands. Belize issued a purple alert, urging citizens in offshore islands to seek safety on the mainland. Guatemala also prepared for the storm, warning residents to stay in port and seek shelter. Many people heeded these warnings, evacuating to safer locations. Despite these precautions, the sheer size and intensity of Mitch would soon overwhelm these efforts. As October 29th approached, residents braced for impact, unaware of the devastation that awaited them. On October 29th, Hurricane Mitch made landfall in Honduras, with winds of 80 miles per hour. However, the storm's most damaging feature was not just its winds, but the torrential rain that it brought. For 2 days, Mitch poured down rain at an astonishing rate, sometimes up to 4 inches an hour. The slow-moving storm caused rivers to overflow and landslides to sweep across the mountainous regions. The effects were catastrophic. Many people lost their homes to flooding and mudslides, while roads and infrastructure were destroyed. During this time, reports of the disaster flooded in from various areas. In Honduras, entire communities were submerged and many people became trapped in their homes. The situation in Nicaragua was no less dire. One mudslide alone claimed the lives of 2,000 individuals. The destruction was overwhelming, and in the days that followed, the death toll climbed steadily. By the time the storm began to lose its strength, the damage was already immense, with estimates of over $5 billion in losses. The disaster's impact would be felt for years, affecting countless lives and changing the landscape of the region forever. After Hurricane Mitch passed, the landscape of Central America was forever altered. The natural environment bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Rivers that once flowed calmly became raging torrents, causing unprecedented flooding. In some areas, rainfall totals reached 36 inches, leading to massive mudslides that buried homes and communities. The flora and fauna suffered immensely. The hurricane uprooted trees and destroyed vast areas of vegetation, particularly in Honduras. One island, Guanaja, was left almost entirely barren, as winds exceeding 125 miles per hour tore through it. The aftermath of the hurricane was marked not only by physical destruction, but also by a humanitarian crisis. Many people lost their homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. In addition to the immediate destruction, the storm also brought about outbreaks of diseases such as cholera, leptospirosis, and dengue fever. The lack of clean water and adequate shelter allowed these diseases to spread rapidly, further compounding the tragedy. The people of Central America faced an uphill battle to recover from the devastation. Hurricane Mitch is remembered as one of the deadliest and most destructive hurricanes in history, leaving a lasting impact on Central America. The storm destroyed decades of progress in Honduras and Nicaragua, with President Carlos Roberto Flores stating that it wiped out 50 years of development in Honduras alone. Countries around the world responded with aid, contributing a staggering $6 billion to assist in recovery efforts. This funding was crucial for rebuilding infrastructure and supporting communities in need. In the years that followed, the effects of Hurricane Mitch remained evident. Many people were forced to rebuild their lives from scratch, while some took the opportunity to construct stronger, more resilient homes. The economic situation in the region remained fragile. The loss of agricultural land and livelihoods pushed many families into poverty. Hurricane Mitch served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by communities in the path of natural disasters. The storm not only claimed lives, but also reshaped the future of the region, prompting governments to take measures to improve disaster preparedness and response in hopes of preventing such a catastrophe from occurring again. Hurricane Gilbert was one of the most destructive and intense hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. In fact, when it hit in 1988, it was considered the most powerful hurricane in the Atlantic basin in terms of barometric pressure, a record that stood until 2005 when Hurricane Wilma surpassed it. Gilbert formed during the 1988 Atlantic hurricane season, which had already been active. However, no one expected the level of devastation this storm would bring. The story of Hurricane Gilbert starts in early September 1988. It began as a tropical wave off the northwestern coast of Africa, like many Atlantic hurricanes do. As it crossed the Atlantic, it gradually gained strength, eventually growing into a massive Category 5 hurricane, the most powerful on the Saffir-Simpson scale. At its peak, it had sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, and its massive wind field stretched up to 575 miles in diameter, making it one of the largest hurricanes ever observed in the Atlantic. Gilbert first made landfall in Jamaica on September 12, 1988. Before continuing its path of destruction through the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, the storm's sheer size and strength made it one of the most dangerous and costly hurricanes in history, leaving a path of devastation in its wake. Entire regions were flattened, thousands of homes were destroyed, and it led to the deaths of over 400 people. The storm caused approximately $3 billion in damage, and its name was retired forever due to its catastrophic impact. In the aftermath, Hurricane Gilbert left an indelible mark on the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast. Its widespread destruction to communities, lives, and economies made it a defining moment for the Atlantic hurricane season of 1988. This storm was one of the worst natural disasters of the time, and it took years for many affected regions to fully recover. To understand the full scope of this devastating event, we need to look at how it all began and how it grew into the monster storm that it became. Hurricane Gilbert's origins can be traced back to a tropical wave, a low-pressure system moving from east to west, that moved off the coast of Africa on September 3, 1988. For several days, this wave traveled across the Atlantic, remaining relatively disorganized. However, on September 8th, satellite images revealed that the system was starting to develop a well-defined circulation center. At this point, it was located roughly 400 miles east of Barbados, and meteorologists began to take notice. By the next day, the National Hurricane Center, NHC, classified it as a tropical depression, the 12th of the season. As the tropical depression moved west-northwestward, it encountered favorable conditions for strengthening: warm ocean waters and low wind shear. On September 9th, the depression intensified into Tropical Storm Gilbert. Over the next few days, it steadily gained strength as it passed through the Lesser Antilles, bringing high winds and heavy rains to the islands. By late on September 10th, Gilbert had intensified into a hurricane as it moved south of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. By this time, warnings were being issued across the Caribbean. Gilbert's rapid intensification continued. On September 11th, it became a Category 3 major hurricane, with winds of 125 miles per hour. It was clear that this was no ordinary storm, and preparations were ramping up across the Caribbean. In Jamaica, hurricane warnings were issued, and residents were urged to evacuate coastal areas and prepare for the worst. Schools, businesses, and government offices were closed, and thousands of people sought shelter. Airlines canceled flights to and from the region, and in the Cayman Islands, residents were evacuated by Cayman Airways as the storm barreled toward them. Across the region, people were bracing for a potentially catastrophic event. Despite these preparations, many did not fully realize the scale of the disaster they were about to face. On September 12th, Gilbert made landfall on Jamaica as a Category 3 hurricane. It was the first major hurricane to hit the island directly in over 30 years. The storm's 15-mile-wide eye passed directly over the island, battering it with torrential rains and devastating winds. But this was just the beginning, as Gilbert was about to grow even stronger as it moved back over open waters. Hurricane Gilbert's most destructive phase began after it made landfall in Jamaica on September 12, 1988. While Jamaica bore the brunt of the storm initially, this was only the start of Gilbert's deadly path through the Caribbean and beyond. After devastating Jamaica, the storm moved westward into the warm waters of the Caribbean Sea, where it rapidly intensified. Within hours, Gilbert had reached Category 5 intensity, the highest possible rating on the Saffir-Simpson scale. By September 13th, Gilbert had become a monster storm, with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, and its central pressure had dropped to 888 millibars, making it the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic up until that time. As Gilbert approached Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, its massive size and strength became even more apparent. Tropical storm force winds extended outward for 575 miles from the storm's center, making it one of the largest Atlantic hurricanes ever observed. The Yucatan Peninsula was directly in Gilbert's path, and on September 14th, the storm made landfall near the island of Cozumel. At landfall, Gilbert was still a Category 5 hurricane, with winds of 165 miles per hour. The impact on the region was catastrophic. Entire communities were flattened by the powerful winds, and a massive storm surge inundated coastal areas. The popular tourist destination of Cancun saw 60% of its beaches washed away, and inland flooding extended up to 3 miles. In addition to the wind and surge, Gilbert dumped over 13 inches of rain in some parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, causing flash flooding and landslides. More than 60,000 homes were destroyed, leaving tens of thousands of people homeless. Over 80 ships sank during the storm, and many areas were completely cut off due to the damage. But Gilbert wasn't finished yet. After crossing the Yucatan, the storm weakened slightly over land, but as it moved into the Gulf of Mexico on September 15th, it began to strengthen again. By the time it made landfall in mainland Mexico on September 16th, it was a Category 3 hurricane, packing winds of 125 miles per hour. The storm moved inland, lashing the city of Monterey with heavy rain and high winds, causing widespread flooding and killing over 150 people. In total, Gilbert was responsible for killing over 430 people across the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast, making it one of the deadliest storms of the 20th century. But the destruction didn't end with its landfall in Mexico. The storm's remnants continued to wreak havoc as it moved north into Texas, bringing tornadoes, flooding, and additional damage. The destruction caused by Hurricane Gilbert was truly staggering. Across the Caribbean, Mexico, and parts of the United States, the storm left behind a trail of devastation that took years to recover from. In total, the storm caused nearly $3 billion in damage, making it one of the most costly hurricanes in history at the time. In Jamaica, where the storm made its first landfall, the damage was extensive. Entire communities were flattened, and many homes and businesses were destroyed. The storm left over $700 million in damage on the island, and it took years for the country to fully recover. The powerful winds and heavy rains caused widespread flooding and landslides, particularly in mountainous areas, and the island's agricultural sector was hit hard, with crops like bananas and sugarcane being wiped out. In Mexico, the impact was even more severe. The Yucatan Peninsula, particularly the coastal areas of Cancun and Cozumel, was hit hardest by Gilbert's ferocious winds and storm surge. Entire stretches of coastline were washed away, and many tourist areas were left in ruins. In the days following the storm, more than 5,000 American tourists were evacuated from Cancun, as the city's infrastructure was in tatters. The inland city of Monterey also faced devastating flooding, as rivers overflowed their banks, washing away homes, vehicles, and even entire buses filled with people. More than 150 people were killed in Monterey alone, many of them swept away by the raging floodwaters. Across northern Mexico, heavy rainfall caused rivers to swell and landslides to occur, leaving many areas cut off from rescue efforts. Even the United States felt the effects of Hurricane Gilbert. Though Texas narrowly avoided a direct hit, the storm's outer bands spawned tornadoes across the state, causing additional damage. Nearly 30 tornadoes were recorded in Texas, including several that caused significant destruction in the San Antonio area. The storm also caused widespread beach erosion along the Gulf Coast, though the damage in the U.S. was relatively minor compared to the destruction in the Caribbean and Mexico. In total, more than 35,000 people were left homeless by the storm, and many areas struggled to rebuild in the aftermath. The sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented, and it took years for many of the affected regions to recover. The storm's name, Gilbert, was retired by the World Meteorological Organization in 1989 due to the extensive damage it caused, a decision made for storms that have a particularly devastating impact. Hurricane Gilbert was more than just a powerful storm. It was a catastrophic event that changed the lives of millions of people in its path. The storm's legacy is one of destruction, loss, and resilience as the affected regions work to rebuild in the years following the disaster. For Jamaica, Mexico, and the other areas hit by Gilbert, it was a sobering reminder of the power of nature and the vulnerability of coastal communities to hurricanes. One of the lasting impacts of Hurricane Gilbert was the widespread recognition of the need for better disaster preparedness and response in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast regions. In the years following the storm, many countries invested in improved forecasting and early warning systems, as well as stronger building codes and infrastructure designed to withstand hurricanes. In the scientific community, Gilbert's intensity and size provided valuable data that helped researchers better understand the behavior of Category 5 hurricanes. The storm's record-breaking low pressure and massive wind field were key factors in advancing our understanding of how hurricanes develop and intensify, especially in the warm waters of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Gilbert also had a profound impact on the economies of the regions it affected. In Jamaica, the storm caused extensive damage to the island's agricultural sector, particularly the banana and sugarcane industries, which took years to recover. In Mexico, the storm had a devastating impact on the tourism industry, particularly in Cancun and Cozumel. The region's economy, heavily reliant on tourism, was crippled as hotels and resorts were destroyed and thousands of tourists were evacuated in the aftermath of the storm. Despite the destruction, Hurricane Gilbert also highlighted the resilience of the people in its path. In the face of such overwhelming devastation, communities came together to rebuild and recover. In Jamaica, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast, people worked tirelessly to rebuild homes, businesses, and infrastructure in the years following the storm. Today, Gilbert remains a benchmark for other major hurricanes. Its legacy is still felt in the regions it affected, and its name is remembered as one of the most destructive storms in history. The lessons learned from Hurricane Gilbert have helped shape how we prepare for and respond to hurricanes today, ensuring that future storms, while still dangerous, will not catch us unprepared.